thank you for inviting me to participate in this series. What you see on the screen there is Lagos. Very dim. Lagos was very grey and blurred in 1924. But that's how it was. So, in a Yoruba language weekly newspaper, which is now crumbling away in the Nigerian National Archive in Ibadan, there's a paper called Akede Eko, which means the Lagos Herald. And in this paper, there is a remarkable text. It's a series of long letters to the editor in Yoruba entitled Ìtàn ìgbésí ayé mi Segilola ẹlẹ́yinjú ẹgẹ́ ẹlẹ́gbẹ̀rún ọkọ láyé. The life story of me, Segilola, endowed with fascinating eyes, one who had 1,000 lovers in her life. So these letters, which formed a series of 30, were published from July 1929 to March 1930. And as you might guess from the rather long title, they purport to be from a former good time girl, a loose woman, harlots. See, the Yoruba vocabulary in this field is extremely rich and diverse. Calling herself Segilola. But of course, Segilola is not her real name. If she revealed her real name, many men still living at the time of her publication would be exposed for their shameful dealings with her. So she says that she's now destitute and dying. She's disfigured by a terrible disease, the result of her debauchery. So she wants to tell her story as a warning to other people, particularly young men and young women of today, so that they can avoid a similar fate to hers. And the letters then go on to recount her life from her birth in 1882, so she says, to the present moments. And they detail her early boyfriends, her expulsion from grammar school because she was caught by the headmistress hanging around the school gates picking up men, the loss of her virginity to a medicine man who, in exchange, gave her invincible seductive powers and also powers of dissimulation, which were equally important. So in her heyday, she gloried in her astonishing beauty. She reigned supreme among the Lagos ladies, and she amassed vast wealth from her admirers' gifts. But now all that has gone. Nothing awaits her but a pauper's grave. Just punishment for her lascivious ways. So as you can imagine, this narrative caused quite a stir in Lagos. Segilola was mentioned continually in editorials, in the contributions of regular contributors to the press, in poems and songs sent in by readers and by admirers who all endorsed the moral value of her message. So a lot of the readers appeared to think that Segilola was a real woman writing on the point of death. So one woman who called herself in a letter, she wrote in to the editor, signed herself Jumoke, but she quickly explained that, of course, Jumoke was no more her own name than Segilola was Segilola's, because Jumoke is testifying that she too had been embarking on the wide and wobbly path to perdition. But, fortunately for her, just in the nick of time, she saw the error of her ways and repented. And she can now confirm that everything Segilola says is absolutely true, because she went there herself. And now there's nothing she likes more than on I think it's a Wednesday evening, to sit down with her husband in their respectable house and read the Confessions of Segilola in Akedieko's wiki edition. Another man, and then in this letter by Jumoke, she sends in a 10-shilling note to be given to Segilola to alleviate her sufferings. Another man, another reader, writes in, signs himself D-A-N, so he doesn't want to reveal his identity either. And he writes in saying, "I take my hat off to you, woman of the fascinating eyes," and then goes on to endorse yet again the moral of her lessons. The valuable lesson that her moral tale imparts. And a lot of people became fascinated by the question of who she really was. There came a kind of feverish obsession with identifying Segilola, and they wrote in to beg the editor to reveal her name. And for instance, a well-known popular poet who actually exists, there's independent evidence this was a real man, called A.B.O. Mabinuri, he sent in a poem, and the poem's refrain was, "Segilola, you are now repenting. It's too late. Akedieku, I ask you as a favor, write down Segilola's name and send it to me." So this heightened excitement and desire to know who Segilola was. But of course the editor steadfastly refused to give away any information that could lead to Segilola being identified. So this story certainly looked real. For one thing, it was tied into real time, so that when she said she just passed her 47th birthday, it was the right day for it to have been if her narrative of when she was born was true. And on the 4th of January 1930, she took the opportunity to wish all her readers a Happy New Year. Yes, so the narrative was hooked into real time. It was also located in real places, so the quarter where she was born, the major churches and schools of Lagos, the names of the streets where her lovers purportedly lived. These were all places that would be immediately recognized by Lagosian readers. The impression of reality was strongly encouraged by the editor of the paper, Akedieku, Isaac Babalola Thomas. So, for instance, in the first episode, he describes in a note how one evening this elderly woman approached him uninvited in his office in Bangboche Street and begged him to agree to publish her story. And he says, this woman sought us out to plead with a sorrowful heart that she wanted to share her life story in Yoruba in our newspaper every week in order to serve as a warning to everyone, both men and women, who relish loose living and promiscuity in their lives. And he then says, well, of course, he had to agree to publish it. He writes editorials commenting on the story, and he periodically inserts a reference to a fresh encounter with her. So, for instance, he describes how he went with the 10-shilling note sent in by Jumoke to try to deliver it to Segilola, and she begged him to give it to a worthier cause than herself. So it's actually a worthy cause that Isaac Babalola was championing himself at the time in the paper. So the serial went on, and at the very end of the serial, there is Segilola appears to be about to be ascending to heaven. She's singing a hymn, and she seems to be on her way into the other world. And then nothing else happened. And then after the serial finished, the episodes were collected together and published as a book. And this is an advertisement advertising the book. Then, soon after that, it was translated very cursorily into English, we don't know by whom, and serialized again in Arcadiaco in its shortened English version. Gradually, it became apparent, it began to emerge that these letters were not real letters from a real courtesan confessing her unfortunate past. It became apparent that Segilola was fictional. And eventually, the life story of Miss Segilola came to be regarded as the first Yoruba novel, and standing at the head of a really huge Yoruba language literary tradition, which has now gone through several generations and has had lots of books and university courses built around it. So, Itan Igbesi Aye Miss Segilola is now seen as the precursor of this huge, great tradition of the novel in Yoruba. And so I.B. Thomas, the editor of Arcadiaco, is now regarded as the author of the first Yoruba novel. And here he is. And as you can see, he looks very authorial and worthy of the attribution. That's him when he's traveling in the UK. He actually preferred a photograph of himself on a visit to the north, where he took a ride on a camel, and he put that as the frontispiece of the second edition of the book. So the book went through 3 editions and, as I say, became established as a literary narrative. So that's the material. Is this thing working? That's the material I want to present to you. But why? Why am I telling you this story about Segilola? Well, I think there were 2 broad, theoretical kind of questions that we can bring this case study to address. And the first is a question which is central to anthropology, and that's the question of how new cultural forms come into being, how they take shape, how cultural innovations become institutionalized and perpetuated, or, on the contrary, how they fail and are forgotten. So anthropologists believe that they are particularly well placed to engage with this kind of question, because ethnographic fieldwork involves immersion in everyday life. What you're supposed to do is sit in a village for several years, or used to before it became more fashionable just to do a few focus groups, and you absorb the microscopic details of what's going on around you. For instance, you hear a saying being coined and then catching on, and then being incorporated into a poetic genre and getting perpetuated into the future. Or you hear an idea being broached, a proposal developed from it, a meeting held, and eventually the dispensary is built. Or everything falls apart and the participants all quarrel and everyone gives up and the project never takes place. So that's the kind of microscopic, incremental development in the way things are institutionalized, which anthropology is situated to deal with, to tackle. Now, at first sight, a bunch of obscure, dusty old newspapers written 90 years ago might not seem the most promising place to go if you're interested in tracing the emergence of new cultural forms in the very act of their taking shape. But I want to suggest that these texts that I've been introducing you to do have some possibilities for this kind of inquiry. First of all, these weekly papers, I'll tell you more about the fact that there were several of these papers, were full of serials, serialized texts. So they weren't newspapers in the modern sense. The author-editors who operated on a shoestring couldn't afford to send reporters out to gather news, to gather information. So the papers were more like platforms for commentary, satire, criticism of the colonial authorities, gossip about the comings and goings of the small elite that dominated Lagos cultural life. So to fill the pages, it was very helpful to have a recurrent format. So you'd have a slot, which each week would be filled by something of that same type. So you could have a slot for advice to young men or young women. You could have a slot for open letters to notables in Lagos. You could have a slot for histories of Lagos, which were very popular, or series on Yoruba war heroes from the 19th century. So the fact of seriality means that you can trace from week to week the way things are added, the way certain genres are developed in certain directions. And some of these series were dropped because they weren't receiving the right kind of response. So sometimes they were abandoned, sometimes they were elaborated, and sometimes they just went on for a long time. So that's one reason why these newspapers are a promising field, because of seriality. Second reason is that texts published in newspapers are a low investment enterprise compared with, for instance, trying to publish a book, where you have to put a lot of resources into producing it. And then if it doesn't work, if it's not popular, you've lost your investment. Whereas with a newspaper, you can try something out a few times, see if there's a reaction. If it doesn't work, you can drop it, no great cost, and try something new. So that meant that the newspapers were a good place to do experiments. And thirdly, the newspapers of this period were constituted very much as hosts, as spaces which required people to contribute from various different angles and sources. So readers wrote in, there were regular contributors who sent in material. They weren't paid, they just liked to be in the paper. Occasional contributors when they felt like doing it. And then the editor proprietors were constantly twisting their friends' arms and getting them to put things in, or they were culling material from all kinds of other sources, including the British press, which they read avidly, and each other's papers. They were constantly quoting each other's papers and taking issue with what other papers in Lagos had said. So they're constituted as hosts, and this is partly why the general style of the papers was epistolary. People were writing in, and even when the material that was sent in was not in fact a letter, it was very often presented as a letter. So the kind of default format was the letter to the editor, even if it was actually a column or something else. And these spaces where all these materials were brought together were highly interactive, as I've also already suggested. There were constant responses from readers. So what this allows us to do is to trace the emergence of new forms in the papers, not new forms in general, but how they emerge from their inception and how they are developed and how they are shaped and influenced by the interaction of the writers and the readers. I suggest that to approach the appearance of the novel in Lagos, as a genre. To approach it like this is to approach it from the opposite end to the approaches taken by influential theories of the novel that see it above all as a European export. Franco Moretti, for instance, who tracks the spread of the novel genre from France and England across the world. And he says the form is exported from Europe and filled, so the form is exported from Europe, and then it's filled with local content. And he says this leads to a compromise between foreign form and local content. Now, an approach that starts on the ground from where the thing is being generated would suggest, rather, that a text like Iton Igbesi Ayemi Segilola actually emerged from a pool of resources, a repertoire of materials, forms and styles that were already in circulation in Lagos in the 1920s, and in fact make up the warp and woof of these newspapers' contents. The forms that I.B. Thomas drew on were not mainly what you'd call traditional or obviously wholly indigenous forms. They weren't the great hallowed Yoruba oral traditions. What he drew on was, for instance, the fact that everybody was writing letters. Letters were so much the stock in trade of all literate people. Hymns, sermons, editorials, advice columns, all these ingredients you can trace in the narrative of Segilola. You can see them all appearing in different transformations. And he also incorporated a lot of oral forms. But again, these were not the hallowed great traditions of the Yoruba people. What he incorporated was recent urban popular songs and anecdotes and allusions to comical things that had happened in Lagos 10 or 20 years earlier. So kind of urban folklore rather than cultural heritage. And these urban popular songs were themselves the product of the colonial era. So I'm not making a distinction between endogenous and exogenous. I'm making a distinction between starting on the ground and starting from the idea that the shell, the form, the idea has been imported, and that's the important thing, that the history has to start from the place of origin, which was, in Moretti's model, France or England. So, rather than saying, oh, an epistolary novel about female sexual transgression, he must have read Clarissa. I will say, let's look around Lagos and see what preoccupations animated the writer and reader and what formats and genres were at their disposal to build something that answered to their preoccupations. So that's the first broad question, is how you trace the emergence of new forms and trace how they become consolidated. And the second broad question, which I'll mention much more briefly, is that I think this kind of case study may give us some leverage on the question of how new genres address their readers, and in doing so, how they convene new publics. And for this, I'm taking a leaf out of the book of Michael Warner, Publics and Counterpublics, who suggests that publics are not pre-existing entities waiting to be identified by a writer. Rather, they're convened in and through the act of being addressed. It's the address that constitutes the public. It's when people accept the address, respond to the address, that they are becoming a public for that genre. Now, not only does the mode of address convene a public, it's also a significant property of the genre itself. And here I turn to Bakhtin, who wrote about addressivity. He called it the quality of turning to someone. So a way of directing utterance towards a listener or reader. And he says that addressivity is a constitutive feature defining the genre of a text. So put these two things together, Warner and Bakhtin, and it appears that addressivity is central both to the constitution of new genres and to the nature of the new audiences and publics that these genres convene. So it's as if addressivity is the hinge between the text and the public. So Segilola is a good case study for exploring this question, because Yoruba language print culture in the 1920s was absolutely fizzing with experiments in how to address readers. It was marked by a proliferation of new genres, and these were all created or developed in an unprecedented effort to reach a new popular audience. So my two questions are really inseparable: how a new genre emerges and how its mode of address to an audience shapes the genre and constitutes the audience is really one question. Now, to make sense of this, I next need to give you a bit of context. There you are. That's the context. Lagos was the capital, administrative headquarters, and the principal port of Nigeria at this period. In the 1920s, it was characterized by a very volatile economy, a reliance on commerce and waged labor rather than on agricultural production. It was characterized by very rapid population increase caused by in-migration from the hinterland, which was giving rise to increasing heterogeneity of the population. And it was also marked, and this is very important, by a rapid increase in literacy. In fact, in the 1921 census, Lagos was recorded as having a literacy rate of 30%, which was incredibly high for 1921. Although it was said in the census that of this 30%, only 10% could actually write. The other 20% could read, but not write. So this suggests that there was a big constituency of people who were only partially literate, who could read but not write. And these people almost certainly would not have been able to read in English. They could only read probably in Yoruba. Now, the 1920s was also a time of intensifying political ferment. Above all, focusing on the colonial government's deposition of the traditional head of Lagos City, the Ileku. And they campaigned throughout the 1920s for his reinstatement and eventually succeeded, and he was recalled from exile in 1931 and then died in 1932. So he only had a brief period on the throne. So who were these people campaigning? Well, they were led by a very small educated elite, mainly Christian, many of them professionals, lawyers, doctors, clergymen, surveyors, engineers, or wealthy and successful businessmen. And at the core of this elite were the people called Saro, which is an abbreviation of Sierra Leone, and they were called Saro because they were the recaptives from the slave trade in the 19th century, who had been saved from the slave ships, deposited in Freetown, Sierra Leone, and after some time, when they'd become Christianized, educated, English speaking, and so on, some of the more adventurous of them began to make their way back to their putative homelands in the Yoruba speaking area of what later became Nigeria. So these people were culturally very different from the Lagosian majority. They called themselves the long-trousered Creoles to distinguish themselves from the ones who wore gowns, the alagbada. So the ones wearing long trousers were the very anglicized elite. And in the 19th century, they'd been quite keen to preserve their distinctness and to stay aloof from the mass of the townspeople who were pagan, illiterate, and increasingly Muslim. But in the 20th century, things began to shift. They became disillusioned with the colonial authorities' reluctance to make room for them to take over the reins of power. And they began, instead of aligning themselves with the British in distinction from the mass, they began to see that it would be to their advantage to align themselves with the mass in order to better to be able to challenge the colonial government. Not all of them did this, but the leader of the radicals who took this line of action was Herbert Macaulay, who was a great press. He owned newspapers. He wrote a lot for the newspapers. He cultivated a huge popular following, including all the market women of Lagos. And he was a real thorn in the side of the colonial governor. So it was this activity of the elites who controlled and dominated the cultural life of the city and who owned the newspapers, both English language and Yoruba language. It was this activity which led to an efflorescence of the press in the 1920s. So print culture in Yoruba and English, which was actually of long standing in this region. There had been newspapers in both Yoruba and in English since the 1860s, but it's been quite quiet around up to about 1920. In the 1920s, there was an explosion of activity. So there were 9 new English language papers created in those 10 years, and there were 5 new Yoruba weeklies, all in a very similar format. So there were small tabloids. They were made up of a kind of miscellany of little scraps of news or advertisements, homemade kind of advertisements. And as you can also see, they were, although they're always called the Yoruba newspapers, they're actually bilingual. They had English inserts into them. So so this was the context, this explosion of print culture, including print culture in the Yoruba language, which was a new phenomenon. There had been Yoruba papers, but never so many at once, and never sustained over such a long period. The last one, which had been called Iwe Iroyin, which just means newspaper, in Lagos, had run from 1888 to 1892, so just for 4 years. Whereas these papers, some of them lasted 30 or 40 years and had much bigger readerships. So how did this happen? Well, how did the Segilola genre emerge from this situation in the press? Well, as I've already said, Segilola was constructed from formats and ingredients that were already circulating in this fermenting scene of print culture and from a lot of popular oral genres as well. It was animated, though, by a perceived deterioration in morals in the modern city, and this was focused mainly, although not exclusively, on women, which is often the case in patriarchal societies which are undergoing rapid social change, including changes in gender roles. So there's nothing surprising about that. But this concern about women, wayward women, and dangerousness of urban women was particularly sharp in the time when Segilola appeared, 1929-1930, because the effects of the depression, worldwide depression, were beginning to be felt in the job market. There was a lot of unemployment. A lot of people believed that because of this downturn, joblessness, loss in the value of money, loss in business, there was a perception that women were therefore sending their daughters out onto the streets, or actually going onto the streets themselves to make ends meet. So this idea of the prostitute suddenly appeared in many more sites in the newspapers than had been the case before. There were more reports of the police rounding up prostitutes and herding them off to the police station. Many more commentaries on the evils of Lagos wayward women and harlotry. But I want to suggest that the completion and the success of this novel at that particular moment was in no way a foregone conclusion. Its emergence wasn't just something that, it was bound to happen because the novel was spreading. Its emergence was incredibly precarious, and it was always at risk of failure. In fact, there'd been another experiment about 3 years before, also a fictional work, and also in the voice of a woman, and also serialized in one of these 5 Lagos Yoruba newspapers, which had been abandoned. It didn't come to fruition. So what made it so precarious? Well, the continuation of the newspaper itself always hung in the balance. The print runs were small, subscribers didn't pay up, vendors who sold the paper often sold the paper but didn't hand the money over to the newspaper editor proprietor. Week by week, the newspaper editor proprietor took his bundle of materials to a printer, and some weeks he didn't have the cash to pay the printer up front, so that week the paper wouldn't appear. So the survival of the Segilola narrative and the survival of the newspaper were interdependent, because the story, which was so salacious and sensational, boosted sales. But on the other hand, if Segilola was going to survive and tell her story, the newspaper had to continue. So, in one letter, Segilola writes, "Before I, Segilola, proceed with my life story, I want you, the distinguished editor of Akedeko, to give me leave to preface it with 1 or 2 remarks. The first is about the irregular publication of your newspaper for the last 2 weeks or so. Do you realize, oh distinguished editor, that it is me, Segilola, whom this irregular publication affects most? Because she won't be able to unburden herself of her sinful story and thereby achieve redemption." And then she adds, "If this was the time when I was still in my heyday, I would not have had to pay more than a couple of calls on prominent gentlemen in this city of Lagos before I found someone who would help you out in this noble work of yours with a substantial donation. For my sake," she says. But alas, this is no longer the case, and all she can do is pray for him and invite him to sing a hymn with her in the hope that it will improve his financial situation. So it's precarious. It's never sure that this novel is actually going to come out. The text was constituted through constant interaction with readers, because when readers write in, Segilola replies, and her replies to their texts, to their letters, are retained in the publication of the novel, even when it's become second edition, third edition, been reprinted recently in a modern spelling edition. They all keep her responses to the reader's letters, which suggests that they are regarded as an integral part of the text. So not only this, but some of the ancillary texts, like D.A.N.'s letter where he says, "I take my hat off to you, lady of the fascinating eyes," or Mabin Wari's poem, these continue to be published as kind of ancillary materials along with the novel. So the novel is being visibly, consciously constituted out of this interaction with readers. Her mode of address to her readers was colloquial, it was impetuous, it was highly emotional. She buttonholes the reader, insists on attention, invites readers, as I've just mentioned, to join her in prayer or in singing a hymn. And she's very often overcome by her emotions, sometimes to the point where she can't continue writing. So, for instance, in one letter she says, "Oh, oh, 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 wouldn't death be preferable to the mockery that I am subject to today, since I have no sympathizer left in the world? I, Segilola, born into a good family, no longer have people around to support me, but have been reduced to writing in the newspaper today for the whole world to read about things that expose me to mockery and ridicule. Oh, my fortune is indeed bad. Grievous lamentations." She doesn't stop there. She goes on, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa. What? I will stop here for this week, because my grief has wounded my heart and caused my eyes to stream with tears, which do not allow me to continue at present." So the story that she'd promised, the episode she'd promised she was going to tell that week, which was going to be pretty salacious, she's now postponed it to next week because she's so overcome with lamentations and grief. I will try next week to recount how I spent my girlhood days, and we know that's going to be good. So, as you might have noticed in this last quotation, she shifts in the scope and scale of her address. So she is at one moment addressing the editor, and she has nothing but the highest praise for I.B. Thomas. But she also convenes a readership which is specifically Lagosian, people who can pick up her references and allusions to local memory. But then she says she's writing her story for the whole world to read. And she often returns to this idea that she's addressing what she calls the four corners of the world, which is the idea of public imagined as in principle indefinitely large. So even though she's writing in Yoruba, she writes as if potentially non-Yoruba speakers could read and benefit from her text. So it's being projected out into a kind of virtual, enormous public. And this is one reason why all these writers were so excited about print, because they felt that they had this potential vast public. She's not only writing for the present day public, but she's also writing for a notional future. She's writing, she says, for the benefit of all of you of my generation and race, and the generations that are to come. So I often think posterity has a lot of reading to do, and in this case she's definitely lining it up for posterity to read, so that her experience can lay the foundations for a better future. So here's the thing, as they used to say in Desperate Housewives. I think it's a long time ago. What I.B. Thomas, along with his fellow author editors of the 1920s Yoruba or bilingual newspapers, was doing was convening a new public. What public? Most immediately, he was convening the 20% of Lagosians who could read but not write, and who could therefore read Yoruba but not English. And beyond that, a wider public, a national, an African, and a global public. But this particular local public, the Lagosian public, he was doing it at that particular moment in the 1920s because of this new sense among the political elite that it would be advantageous for their leaders to be seen to have popular political support when they were challenging the British colonial governments. So all the Yoruba language papers actively reached out to this potential readership, the Yoruba language potential readership, and they all used highly inventive and creative modes of addressing them in order to draw them in. But there was one innovation among all this experimentation which was particularly successful and which was particularly long remembered, and that was this Yoruba novel. And I want to suggest that the reason for this was that its particular mode of address was especially gripping. It enabled it to bind the new public to it much more tightly than any of the other forms of address in the other genres which were being experimented with. And I think that's not only because of its obviously sensational subject matter, which you think would be a very good reason to grip a lot of people, but a lot of other genres also referred a lot to prostitution and denounced female waywardness, satirized men who spend all their money on prostitutes. So why was it this one? Why was it the novel? I want to suggest that it was because by writing it in the voice of a harlot, I.B. Thomas was released from the obligation to maintain a consistently authoritarian and condemnatory judgment on sexual freedom and waywardness. Now, it's true that the narrative is continually presented as an awful warning to anyone contemplating, like Jumoke did, the wide path to perdition. And Segilolá's pious lamentations are absolutely incessant. They've even been described by present-day born-again Christians who are about as hardline as you can get. These lamentations have been described as excessive and nauseating. So she's really full on in her moral disapprobation of herself. But because it's told as if by a woman and not by the respectable editor, who was a lay preacher and an upright moral authority, it means that the text can accommodate other views as well as the authoritative condemnatory view. Seeded all through this text are popular songs. On that page you can see how frequently ditties, as they used to call them, are quoted. Every letter has several popular songs in it. And these songs very often, in fact almost always, hint at a more relaxed understanding of sexuality and morality in general than Segilolá's own voice. So, for instance, when Segilolá's husband, she does get married at one point. She's very happy about this because it gives her legal rights. When he discovers that she's not a virgin on their wedding night, she's obviously a bit embarrassed, especially as the in-laws all come and make a noise outside the bedroom door. But then she consoles herself with a philosophical popular song which says, "We met it on earth, taking lovers, having paramours, we met it. We're not the ones who started it." So this kind of cynical, humorous, shoulder-shrugging, defiant, sarcastic, worldly-wise note crops up all the way through the text, not in Seguilola's own personal voice, which she's so insistent on putting across, but in all these things that she quotes, which are, of course, anonymous and collective and popular. So she doesn't say on her own authority that promiscuity is the way of the world and always has been, but she lets that opinion filter into her text. Now, I.B. Thomas, the prolific writer in multiple genres, couldn't do this in any of his other genres where he was the acknowledged speaker. He could only do it through a double displacement made possible first by impersonating a fallen woman and then getting the fallen woman to quote an unattributable song. So, in other words, in answer to the question, why this genre constituted around this form of address at this moment in Lagos history, I would tentatively answer, because it's only through this genre, first-person fiction in the voice of a woman who's enjoyed the high life and then sunk into the low life of Lagos, that elite authors like I.B. Thomas can really make contact with this new readership in waiting that they were seeking to convene at that particular moment in Lagos political history. So it looks to me as if I.B. Thomas can't really be described as having adopted a foreign format, the novel, and then found some local content to infuse into it. It seems to me he ingeniously combined a whole range of formats that he was already practicing. He was already writing all these forms that he put into the novel. He put them all together and then he added the magic ingredients, which was fiction. All these other genres are not fictional. And it's fiction in the voice of a narrator who's far removed from his own position in life. So it's this fiction that allows his suspension of responsibility, which makes it possible to infuse this popular worldly wisdom, and therefore makes it possible to have this intense engagement with a public which was more on the streets than the Lagosian elite were. But given the electrifying power of this narrative in the late 1920s Lagos society, maybe it's not surprising that he actually went further than this. Although I said at the beginning it gradually emerged that this story was fiction and that it eventually came to be credited with being the first Yoruba novel, I.B. Thomas continued to disavow the very claim to authorship right up to the end. Even in his third edition, which had the imprimatur of the Church Missionary Society, was published by the CMS Press, even then it maintained the pretense that Akedeko, the newspaper, had the copyright, but that there was no author. The author was the Confessions of a Courtesan. And so here is the magician in his white suit. He never ever said he was the author of Itan Gbesi Ayé Seguilola. So that's the end of my story.